All righty. Again, I'm Keith Reid, editor of Fuel Marketer News. Today's webinar is on electric and high-octane vehicles, developments and implications. Excuse me, I'm having a little technical difficulty with my presentation. Sorry about that. Just a second, please. There we go. Today's presenter will be John Eichberger. John is the Executive Director of the Fuels Institute, a nonprofit independent think tank founded and managed by NACS in 2013. The Fuels Institute draws together various stakeholders from the vehicle and fuels industries, including public interest, community, and academia, to collaborate on the critical issues facing the transportation industry. My name is Keith Reid. I began working at National Petroleum News magazine in 1999, performed most of the editorial functions, moving up to editor-in-chief in 2007, at which time I also became editor-in-chief of Fuel Oil News. NPN subsequently went out of business. I currently serve as the editorial director and a partner at Fuel Marketer News. A quick note on questions. Please submit written questions at any time using your attendee dashboard. We will not be using the audio feature for questions. The main reason for that is it's real easy to have audio issues that come into play, such as feedback and echoes and such. So, but what I'll do is you can enter a question anytime. When we get to the end of John's presentation, we'll just start going through the questions, and hopefully we'll have a fairly interactive discussion on what we've just learned. You know, what's old is new again. Electric vehicles are hardly a new technology. The last couple of decades, they've certainly gained some prominence, but they've really been around since the 1890s, or earlier than that. They're really almost as old as electricity as a public service itself. From the Electric Auto Association in the late 1890s, electric vehicles outsold gasoline cars 10-1. Electric vehicles dominated the roads and dealer showrooms. Some automobile companies like Oldsmobile and Studebaker actually started out as successful EV companies, and only later did they transition to gasoline-powered vehicles. In fact, the first car dealerships were exclusively for electric vehicles. And I think some of the issues, you know, we went to the fossil fuel-related propulsion after that, and I think some of the issues in play back then are still considerations today, even though the technology has, you know, developed in leaps and bounds since then. You know, it comes down to basically battery life, range, and those type of issues. The second topic, high-octane fuels and engines, is, you know, it's also another thing that's, you know, not as new as we might assume. Fuels, and here's from the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, fuels that blend between 25 to 40% ethanol with conventional gasoline instead of the current 10% ethanol blends can lead to greater fuel efficiency, lower overall greenhouse gas emissions. Additionally, the introduction of this high-octane mid-level ethanol fuel could provide an optimized fuel source for more efficient internal combustion engines that car makers are developing, and that, in fact, some of the Washington policy now is kind of pushing out. You'll notice the vehicle next to the slide is not a car, it's an airplane. One of the interesting facts of our history as a fuels industry is that, you know, during World War II, you know, while a lot of people give credit to our refiners for providing the free world with vast quantities of gasoline and diesel and other fuels, and you know, a really untold story is the fact that in the middle of the war, towards the late part of the war, our automakers developed very high octane aviation fuel. You know, at the time, automobile fuel had an octane rating of about 30 to 40. Most aviation fuels had a rating of about 130. But we were developing a successful aviation fuel had an octane rating of 150. And that allowed, you know, with minor modifications, the existing aviation engines of the day to produce more horsepower and actually, give our, fighter aircraft towards the end of the war an extra 15 to 20 miles an hour in performance, with a few maintenance issues, but nothing that wasn't seen as being worth the trouble. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand things over to John right now, and John can get into it. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. What we thought we'd do today is we've got a couple of topics at our meeting later on this month in Indianapolis that I thought we'd kind of give a preview and start discussing a little bit from my perspective. And those are, as Keith kind of gave a preview, electric vehicles and high-octane fuel. I've spent a lot of time in the last several years looking at the various alternative fuel and alternative vehicle technologies that are out there and trying to figure out what really has legs, what has the potential to gain some significant market share, and what we should really be looking out for in terms of market strategies and what may be coming down the pike. So these are two that are gaining a lot of attention, both from the private sector and from the government, that I thought would be worth us chatting about. So we're going to talk about electric vehicles first, and Keith can go to the third slide there.
Apologize. Here we go.
You go to the next one. And so here, what we're seeing here is we had, the Fuel Systems had Navigant Research do a forecast of the vehicle inventory through 2023. And we broke it down by powertrain. And what I want to point out is that the scale on the bottom of this is 0 to 10%. I took gasoline and flex fuel vehicle technology vehicles out of this chart just to demonstrate the non-gasoline reliant vehicle fleet that may be on the market by 2023. And what I want to point out is you see the orange line there is the diesel market. Everything beyond that is a natural gas, propane, battery electric vehicles, and fuel cell. And if we look at the forecast for 2023, battery electric vehicles, this is just pure battery electric, not plug-in, not hybrid. Navigant is forecasting will represent about 0.8% of the market. That's not 8%, that's 0.8% of the registered vehicles in 2023. Now, if we go to the next slide, we can take a look at what Department of Energy. Now, keep in mind, the government, both federal and state level, is pretty bullish on promoting electric vehicles. And so understanding what the U.S. Energy Information Administration thinks might be the future of these technologies is critical. And so this chart is derived from the Annual Energy Outlook report published by the Energy Information Administration earlier this year, going through 2035. And again, I pulled gasoline variants out of the equation just to show it on a 10% market scale. And what I want to point out here is I combined battery electric, plug-in, and hybrid. In 2015, they're about 1.7% market share. By 2035, they're projected to reach almost 5% market share. The instructive element, however, is 3.7% of that's going to be hybrid. So hybrid vehicles are gasoline vehicles that have a battery support system. They do not plug into the grid, so they are not operating on electricity only. They are truly a combination operating vehicle, not plugged into the grid. So when we start looking at plug-in electric vehicles and battery electric vehicles, we're really looking at still less than 1% market share by 2035, and that's Department of Energy forecasts. So when we start thinking about that, I get people asking me a lot from the retail side, should I be thinking about putting in electric charging stations? And my response has always been, based upon the forecast, they're not really a threat because there's only 1% market share by 2035. And they're really not an opportunity either because most of the electric vehicles are being sold to those consumers that drive less than 40 miles a day. Those consumers aren't typically the ones to stop off at a gas station to refuel on the way home. If we go to the next slide, the Fuels Institute had Pinchon Berlin, which is a recognized national polling organization, do a poll in July and ask customers, want to find out how many miles did they drive. And we haven't released the data yet, so this is kind of a preview of it. But this shows you on a weekly basis, consumers drive about 200, 220 miles a week. And 92 of those are to and from work, and 73 are family and errands they run. That means that on a daily basis, they're averaging about 30 miles a day, round trip. And most battery electric vehicles are delivering 80 to 100 mile charge, miles per charge. So you're looking at a situation where, for the majority of Americans, the range in today's battery electric vehicles and plug-in vehicles that operate on electricity only before the gasoline kicks in, might satisfy the needs of most consumers in most markets. And that is something that's important to recognize, because if one of the critical concerns about electric vehicles is the range and getting stranded. If the typical consumer is driving 30 to 40 miles a day and the typical electric vehicle can deliver 80-mile range, then is there a concern? A little personal aside is I was in California about 3 weeks ago, and a friend of mine purchased a Fiat 500 EV. I got a great deal. He's paying like $90 a month for it, and just recharges at work, so never even has to plug in at home. But he has had absolutely no problems with it, and he drives all over the Bay Area, and he's never had to plug in at home. His range, his travel fits his needs. If you've ever driven an electric car, they are a lot of fun. The torque off the line is incredible. They're zippy. They are a very high-performing vehicle. So there are a lot of attributes of an electric vehicle that are attractive to consumers. Not paying for gasoline. Right now, at $2, $2.25 a gallon, people aren't really looking around for alternative transportation methods. But if gasoline is $4.50, and in California it's still close to $4, they're definitely looking at alternatives. And so if the mileage fits, then that's something to be thinking about. Now, the recharging capability of a vehicle is still limited, and there are challenges, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But the popularity of electric vehicles, I think, needs to be recognized. And on the next slide, I've put up a picture of the vehicles. According to Department of Energy's website, all of these vehicles are available in 2015 models for sale in the United States. There are a bunch of them are just pure electric, and some of them are plug-in electric. But that is 23 or 24 models, unique models, 2015 model year that are available for purchase in the United States. Compare that to a couple years ago, when you could probably count the number of electric powertrain vehicles on the market on one or two hands. And this is important because I think as we start looking at market penetration potential for this technology, the more consumers see these vehicles available on the road, at the dealership, in parking lots, the less new and strange they become. And as that newness and that peculiarity starts to wear off, they start becoming more mainstream and more recognizable, the hesitation to buy it actually diminishes. So I think as we start seeing more of these vehicles on the road, we're going to see sales go up. Now, I looked at the numbers from Ward's Auto about vehicle sales, and electric vehicles had like a 25% or 50% increase in sales from 2013 to 2014. Now, they didn't start with a heavy base, so it's not like going from 100,000 units to 200,000 units, but they did see a significant increase. The more variants on the road, the more likely those numbers are going to go up. So I think I start looking at the fact that the electric technology seems to satisfy the commuting needs of most consumers, and more vehicles are coming on the road that are able to be plugged in the grid. I think we're going to see growth in this market. Is it going to take over a lot of market share? Probably not anytime real soon, but it is something that I think we need to be looking at. And if we look at the next slide, this is the last one I have on electric vehicles, kind of summarizes it. So the typical range of an EV is somewhere between 80 to 100 miles. I was talking to a guy a week or so ago who is in the electric recharging industry, and he said that the industry's general expectation is by like 2017, the average range will be 150 to 200 miles. So you're looking at a significant improvement in range. With a typical driver driving 30 miles a day. Now you start looking at charging, because one of the limiting factors is, do the consumers have garages and the ability to charge at the office or at home? And do they have the ability to recharge in market? Now, in-market recharging is limited. So there's about 10,000 places where you can recharge, and there's about 26,000 chargers out there. Most of those are what we call level 2, which is delivering about 10 to 20 miles for every hour plugged in. Now, the vehicle receptivity of the charge varies, so it's a range. But you're looking at 5 to 6 hours to get a full charge for most of the electric vehicles. Is there a potential to have that accelerated? And from a retail model, you're looking at, you need a 5-minute charge for a 100-mile range or more than that. The Tesla Model S has been promoted as a fast charger, because with the Tesla Supercharger, you can get a 50% charge, which is about 125 to 150 miles in about 30 minutes. And that's a significant rate of charge, but that's on a DC direct current. That is a heavy load. So there are limitations in terms of what the batteries can accept, and there's limitations of what the grid can deliver. So there was a report released recently by ICF International that looked at the recharging of vehicles and the load on the grid, and it found that a lot of transformers in certain markets are overloaded already. And when you started adding electric vehicle charging, you increase that overload potential on those transformers. So if you have a significant market increase in electric vehicles all plugging in about the same time, you're going to have to upgrade the electric infrastructure. And one of the things where I'm looking forward to in Indianapolis at the next meeting is we're going to have a couple people come in and talk about battery technology and grid reliability and what the development of grid improvements and the emergence of the electric vehicle market, what they have in common, how they're going to relate to each other. Now, consumers do get a tax credit on the purchase, but that may fade out after a while. I think the economic benefit to people buying electric vehicles is really the elimination of the need to buy gasoline, and that is really kind of driving the interest and the environmental impact. A lot of, it's no secret that electric vehicles are developing fastest in California, which has a zero-emission regulatory requirement on vehicles. They're being rolled out in other metropolitan areas for a variety of reasons, but I think it's a market that is getting a lot of attention, and it may actually have some legs. I've been pretty pessimistic about electric vehicles for quite a while, but I think as we start to realize the relationship of the vehicle to the consumer, the relationship of the consumer to their home charging, their work charging capabilities, all those things play in, and it actually may be a viable option for more consumers than I had previously anticipated. So that's a quick snapshot on the electric vehicle market. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, Keith. The high-octane fuel discussion, as Keith mentioned, high-octane fuel has been around for a long time. If you're a car nut, you understand what the role of octane is. It's to prevent knock and to enable a higher compression ratio engine to improve performance. On the next slide, you can see why some of the OEMs are interested in it. The original equipment manufacturers, the automakers, have certain requirements they have to meet. They have to meet their CAFE standards, their fuel efficiency standards. They have to meet tailpipe emission standards. They have to meet consumer expectations for performance. All these things play in, so they're looking at how can we do that, and octane is one option. So if you had a fuel, and they're kind of looking at a 97 to 100 octane rating at the dispenser, looking at the R plus N divided by 2, it gives you that 97 to 100. That gives you the ability to have a higher compression ratio engine, which increases fuel efficiency, reduces emissions, and reduces carbon emissions, improves performance, and really helps the automakers hit their regulatory requirements and allows them to develop a vehicle that satisfies consumer needs for performance and reliability. A high compression ratio engine with a high octane fuel is going to provide much greater acceleration, much greater overall performance that the consumer is looking for, while benefiting these other factors that society and the government are requiring of the automakers. Now, if you look at the next slide here, we take a look at how do we get there. And so that's the big question, is how do you get to a high octane fuel? Right now, ethanol is the cheapest source of octane out there. And the people who are modeling this are modeling from an E20 to E40. Oak Ridge National Laboratory is doing a lot of work on octane, and they've been doing a lot of vehicle testing on E30 to see what the optimized performance might be. So that's kind of the range. I think E20 to E30 is the range I'm hearing most people talk about these days. And ethanol has other benefits within the fuel in terms of cooling factors and other elements that make it a very attractive octane enhancer. Now, we can talk about distribution, logistics, and some of the handling issues that ethanol brings with it, but in terms of fuel to vehicle performance, ethanol is a very positive option. There are other octane sources. They may be a little more expensive, they may be a little more complicated, they may bring other criteria in terms of environmental performance that may not be necessary or desired in the fuel blending, but there are other sources, and so the refiners are looking at how do you boost octane without using ethanol. And the autos that I've spoken with have said, really, we just want octane. We really don't care what it is, just tell us what it's going to be so we can design an engine that can perform on it. Now that's important to note because flex fuel vehicles, which can run on anything from E0 to E85, they're not optimized. They have to be able to operate on a wide spectrum of octane. So the OEMs are saying what we really need is to be able to calibrate an engine to be the best operating engine if it's running on octane of X, and we need to know what that predictable octane content is going to be. It's going to be ethanol. You know what that volume of ethanol is going to be, so we can accommodate the compatibility issues. So I think initial layout rollout is probably going to be a niche for certain vehicles that need that octane, but there's also discussion about trying to drive the high octane fuel on a wide scale availability relatively quickly. DOE is working on some models to bring high-octane fuel to market in the next 10 years at a substantial retail availability so that the vehicles that are being manufactured can participate in that fuel. The next slide is something I borrowed from our friends over at ICM who have analyzed this quite closely, and it just shows that the relative value of ethanol versus some other blending agents, such as toluene. And you look at the rate of octane boost at the pump that a range of ethanol from 0 to 30 provides compared to toluene, and so you're getting a much better octane boost by bringing ethanol to the product at this point. Now, again, there may be technologies. I think the refiners are extremely capable of identifying how to build a fuel blend that matches the requirements of the vehicles. But I think this chart shows that ethanol right now is getting the attention because it has the properties that are being considered to be advantageous to what we're trying to accomplish in terms of a high octane market. Now, on the next slide, this is an element of why the flex fuel vehicle market may not be the answer. This is a forecast that by 2023 we may have 26 million flex fuel vehicles in the market, which is going to be about 10% market share. From a retail perspective, to offer a brand new fuel for only 10% of your customers is a little challenging. But the bigger challenge is in 2019, the automakers who have been receiving a credit towards fuel economy compliance for every flex fuel vehicle they produce really lose that. And so the incentive for them to produce a flex fuel vehicle kind of goes away in 2019. So there's a lot of skepticism that the production of flex fuel vehicles will continue to increase. And I think a lot of the automakers are thinking, okay, if we can bring a high octane fuel specification engine to market instead of flex fuel vehicles, and that's a strategy we want to pursue. And we think that that's something that's going to be more in keeping with our long-term objectives for consumer appreciation and compliance with regulatory. On the next slide here is kind of the summary of the infrastructure hurdles. So I've always said, if you can bring the best fuel and the best vehicle and design it, but if you can't get it to the consumer and have them buy it, there's no point in even making the effort. And so when we start talking about high octane fuel, we have to understand, how do we get it to retail? Because if the consumer can't buy it, then there's no point. You're going to need additional storage. You're going to need additional dispensing space because it's going to be a separate fuel. The last bullet there is very important. It's not backwards compatible. So if you're going to have an E25, E30 in the market, the vehicles produced today may not be able to run on it. And so it's only going to be new vehicles. So you're going to have some misfueling protections in there, and that's going to require some challenges at the retail side to be overcome. Most tanks underground can probably handle the higher ethanol. Now, you may have some concerns with the connected equipment and the pipes and the risers, so retail is going to have to make sure that that equipment is compatible with the new fuel that's being introduced before they bring it to retail. Most new dispensers are compatible up to E20, are being listed or available for listing to handle E25. So whenever I hear the researchers looking E30, I go, hold on a second. If you can meet the OEM requirements with an E25, that makes the infrastructure rollout a lot easier, because at E25, retailers can obtain the equipment today with very minimal increased cost. If you go to E26 even, the listing and certification for that equipment requires you to buy E85 compatible equipment, which is much more expensive. So the ability to bring a new fuel to market, I've been advising the auto industry and the researchers to really focus on what is the best performance you can get out of a fuel that might be able to fit the infrastructure more easily without the necessary wholesale retrofit that an E30 might require. So we're still a long way from figuring out what the final answer is going to be. In a couple weeks, we're going to have a dialogue in Indianapolis about the role of octane, the fuel producer's perspective on it, what they might be able to do in the auto industry, what they're looking at, and have a discussion about that. But it's something that has been discussed for several years, and Department of Energy is really interested in it. There's been, I've spoken at 3 or 4 conferences on this topic specifically, and I think it's something we need to be paying attention to because it has a potential to really be a significant shift in what the market's looking at. And with that, Keith, I think we'll open up to any questions you or any of our listeners might have.
Thank you, John, and our listeners do have a lot of questions already. And it is interesting. It's, you know, these, if you look at everything that's going on out there, you've got solutions, but, and it's one of the things I know at the Fuels Institute you guys are working pretty hard on is, one of the approaches is how you bring, successfully bring a fuel to market. You know, if you do it in a haphazard manner, it doesn't take off, you know, if people aren't working together. So I think one question up front would be, you know, it does look like an enormous challenge with, you know, the high octane fuels, just looking at, you have a lot of stuff in place, but a lot of stuff needs to be put in place. How might a successful strategy come to play to bring that to market? What elements might need to be involved to get this from the idea stage to something consumers actually use to fill their tanks with?
Well, Keith, I think the first thing is we have to identify what our final nut is we're trying to hit, what octane number we're trying to hit, and what the fuel is going to look like. And I think it's important to keep infrastructure in mind. If we can develop a fuel that requires less than 25% ethanol, that meets the requirements of the auto industry, then your lift to bring that fuel to market is significantly diminished because the equipment already exists. It may not be in place, but it's available, and it's not that much more expensive than regular equipment. So you have the ability to, with some dispensers, to upgrade them for maybe $1,000, $1,500. You have the ability to buy new equipment on a rotating basis that's listed at a higher level. So you have the ability to possibly bring it to retail without as much of a cost as it would be if it was a higher ethanol concentration. So I think that's the first thing. We have to know what the fuel is we're dealing with. I think the refiners have to decide, can they deliver a high octane fuel that meets the automaker's specifications and the emissions profile with or without ethanol, and see what that production capacity looks like, what the cost structure might look like, so we can make informed decisions as to how to build it. The autos need to let us know, let the refiners know, okay, we can build a vehicle that can tolerate up to an E25 with a 98 octane number, and it can also run on an E0 with a 98 octane number, but we need that 98 octane number. So we need to make sure that the autos and the fuel producers are working together to resolve the formulation of the fuel that is necessary, and make sure, you know, with their infrastructure side, make sure it's below that 25% ethanol concentration so that there's not a wholesale replacement of tanks and equipment that's going to be necessary.
Great. Another question, are BEV estimates based on today's technology versus disruptive advances? I suppose that, you know, there's been so much research and development going on, you know, it's, you know, how does that play out into the picture? You know, or is there any way to know?
Right. Well, it's tough. It's tough to know because breakthrough technologies, you know, they haven't happened yet. So we have been waiting for some breakthrough technologies for a while. I spoke with a battery expert at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory about 2 years ago, and he said, you know, we've kind of tapped out the lithium-ion battery capability in terms of the battery itself. Now, there's other structures. So you can do different sequencing and parallel sequencing of the batteries to give you a little bit different range, a little different recharging infrastructure. Most of the forecasts are based upon anticipated market development. So Navigant Research is the one that did the forecast for the Fuels Institute. They spent a lot of time looking at the electric vehicle market. They understand the market very well. So I anticipate that their forecasts take into consideration what they believe to be realistic technology developments or improvements. Department of Energy does the same thing. So I think the forecasts are based upon the currently anticipated market developments. Now, I've always said, if there is a breakthrough, a brand new battery made out of some super juice and chemical composition that allows you to get 250, 300-mile range on a 10-minute recharge, that's a game changer. And you know, if it's a $100,000 car, maybe not so much. But there's definitely the potential for a breakthrough that could really accelerate EV market penetration.
Here's one that, you know, it says the Department of Energy is generally incorrect. Can we trust it? But I think a more roundabout answer to that is a lot of the estimates are based on you know, what are largely a policy push from Washington. Can we trust it? You know, if our audience makes investments here, can we trust that you know, the playing field's going to be the same 10 years from now?
Every forecast is contingent upon the assumptions factored into it and the knowledge base and criteria that's being used by the forecast, which is why I use multiple forecasts when I start looking at what the future might look like. That's why I use the Navigant Research forecast, and I compare it to the Department of Energy forecast. I hear a lot about EIA forecast integrity with regards to gasoline demand forecasts and gasoline demand reports. And the question I come back with, okay, who has a better number? And when the government is really pushing and advocating the electrification of certain markets and the increased market share of electric vehicles, if, Keith, your comment is right, and policy is influencing their assumptions, then take that in consideration. If a bullish organization is forecasting a small market penetration over the next 20 years, that's something you got to think about. But I think it's important when you're trying to figure out what a market strategy is, you have to look at multiple sources. You have to look at multiple forecasts, because if you rely on one forecast only, you're likely going to be led astray. So I would advise take a look at multiple forecasts and then understand what the assumptions are, understand what the biases might be, and then make your own assumptions as to where a middle ground might be.
Great. Another question. Has anybody, have you got a solid forecast for what the gallon displacement's going to be with some of the electronic vehicle increases?
No, because it's tough to do that when you're dealing with less than 1% market share of the electric vehicles. You can take a look at the hybrid market, and the hybrids, I'm kind of disappointed what's happened to the hybrid market. I really thought it'd take off faster. The first hybrid debuted in '98. It was the Honda Insight. The Toyota Prius debuted in '99. Through the end of 2014, I think 1.5 million Priuses have been sold. That's 100,000 a year, which is a good number. But for 15 years, for the best-selling hybrid is only 1.5 million units over 10 years, over 15 years. It's kind of a light market penetration. It's way down on the percentage basis. But even so, you got hybrids sitting about 4% market share forecast, about 2.5%, 3% now. They haven't really had a significant effect on fuel demand. I think the CAFE standards, I think the improvements in internal combustion engines have had much more of an effect on overall fuel demand and forecasts for reduction of fuel demand than any other technology. I think the auto industry has been focusing on that. I think that's why they're looking at high-octane fuel, because if you bring a high-octane fuel product to market, you can improve fuel efficiency, reduce fuel consumption, provide a cost-effective option to consumers, and not ask them to change their behavior. It's very important to keep in mind that any technology you bring to market, if the consumer has to learn something new, you just added a hurdle that has to be overcome before you get market adoption. And so I think electric vehicles, there's a lot of negative things being written about them. You're going to get stranded. You can't get plugged in everywhere. It takes too long to plug in. I think we're a long way before we see any significant fuel displacement from the electric vehicle market.
And here's another question. For all the reasons you mentioned about the, kind of the trends in the electric vehicle, why hasn't hydrogen had more consideration, or I would assume, comparably more penetration? More. It's going to be a niche solution, one would think, as well.
Hydrogen is a different animal. So think about hydrogen vehicle. It's a grid-independent electric vehicle. It is all the benefits of an electric vehicle: zero emissions, high immediate torque, great performance, quiet, silent operation. But you fill up at a fueling station in 3 minutes, and you get 300 to 400 mile range. So a lot of similarities to gasoline with the benefits of electric vehicles. So kind of the transitional element. The reason you're not seeing a significant forecast in hydrogen is it's very nascent technology. It's really, the vehicles were first introduced as for the general public, not just fleets, last year. Hyundai's Tucson fuel cell vehicle came to Southern California to 4 dealerships. It was located there because that's where some hydrogen stations were. And the Toyota Mirai is coming out later this year, and a couple more will come on the market next year. And here's the thing that I like about the hydrogen market. Now, we're talking about very small numbers right now, but the development strategy is where, I think the fuels are just trying to promote market development. Is you have the autos building cars and bringing them to market. At the same time, the fuel stations are being put into service. and you are concentrating and trying to focus on, we're going to service this market, and then we're going to service another market, and we're going to try to connect them, and then we're going to expand out. As we start seeing what makes sense economically, what the consumer reaction is going to be, what the performance is like, once we have the example and the test markets done, then we can expand out with more confidence in a cost-effective way. And so I think the strategy has been very limited, focused, detail-oriented to make sure it's being done right, make sure that the answers are being delivered to the right stakeholders, make sure the right questions are being asked, and that enables the people trying to develop the market the opportunity to perfect it before they go broad. And it may come out, in a couple of years of doing this, they realize, okay, the economics aren't there, but we learned a lot, and what can we do with that technology? I'm really a fan of the hydrogen technology, largely because of what it can deliver if it is market feasible, and I like the strategy to test the market feasibility. And I think if we take that approach to more and more technologies and fuel options, we can avoid some lost investment, and we can really move forward in a collaborative and constructive way to improve the market for our customers.
And this is an interesting question, and one I had looked at a few years back when I was considering an electric vehicle, but don't remember off the top of my head, but I know it was a very appealing consideration if everything else had worked out, was, what's it cost to fill the tank, so to speak, to charge up a car for a full charge, compared to, say, gasoline?
And that varies. It depends on where you're charging and who's paying for it and what type of source it is. So my buddy in California, he fuels up at work. He recharges at work. He never plugs in at home. It doesn't cost him a dime. Now, industrial utility users get a different rate than residential utility users. I will tell you that my local utility provider here in Virginia contacted me about 3 years ago and said, hey, John, if you want to buy an electric vehicle and put in a charging station at your home, you can select from one of these 3 preferential rate plans to apply to all of your electricity use. And likeliness would have been I would have reduced my overall electric bill considerably because the rate they were offering me was fantastic. Now you have to buy a $1,000 or $1,500 charging unit and all this stuff, which is jacks are better, but the ability to reduce your overall rate is available because the utilities, think about this, the electricity plants have to run 24/7, yet demand is not level 24 hours a day. And so these plants are running at 3 o'clock in the morning when nobody's using power. And so it's just a wasted operation, but they can't really dial back because the way it's structured, they have to keep running. So if the utility can find a source for that off-peak production and transmission load, then they're willing to give you a great rate in return. So I think that's really the opportunity for reducing overall electricity cost, is making sure that you're charging in off-peak hours.
Related to that, and there's been a lot going on out of Washington with the current administration's energy plan for utilities and electric generation. Is there a cost perspective relative to what's required to get the grid up to shape, or to really handle this down the road?
Yeah, see that I don't know what the cost is. I think there is a cost, and hopefully Navigant will give us a little insight in a couple of weeks when they come to visit with us. But I think I've talked to several people, and one of the issues I've raised, I've got several people in the electric vehicle market, and I've told them I'm a skeptic. Convince me otherwise. And one of the concerns I expressed is, can the grid withstand a significant boost in demand? I use California as an example. 10 years ago, rolling brownouts and blackouts, because they didn't have enough electricity generation capacity to satisfy the needs of the consumers. Okay, now they're really pushing the electric vehicle market. They have a couple of nuclear power plants that are being decommissioned this year. They don't really like coal-fired power plants because of the environmental contamination. So you start taking consideration the environmental concerns and electric production. Then you start looking at grid reliability and the ability of these transformers to deliver the power to the charging stations on demand. One of my colleagues in the EV market said, John, we're so far away from having such a huge increase in simultaneous demand on the grid that the grid's fine. We're a long way before we get such market penetration that the demand is going to outpace the capacity of the grid. Okay, that's fine, but what if? And if we're already seeing some overloading situations, some transformers, then we need to start thinking about the cost of upgrading the system. Now, I think we need to upgrade the system anyway because we're all using a lot more power than we're ever used to. So it kind of goes hand in hand. And I don't know if EVs are going to require the upgrade or if overall lifestyle is going to require the upgrade. But I think we'll probably be in a situation where we're going to be seeing our electric grid go through substantial reform, and that will facilitate the ability to use electric vehicles on a grid-appropriate manner. So, like I said, I'm not an expert. I don't know what the costs are, but these are the things I'm hearing, and these are the things I anticipate seeing over the next several years, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it in a couple weeks.
I've got a couple questions related back to hybrids being rated for up to E85, which means they could use, I suppose, the lower blends as well down to E10. Certainly, the ones we've discussed. I guess more clarity on the impact of using a mid-range fuel, comparatively speaking, with the existing hybrid vehicles out there that are E85 rated.
So using like an E25 or E30 with a flex fuel vehicle.
Right.
I think what you're going to get is you're going to get better fuel efficiency, likely, than you would with an E85 blend, just because the energy density of the fuel is higher. So that is a consideration. I think some of the retailers are selling an E20, E30 blend, or their customers are quite happy putting into flex fuel vehicles, and they're getting a lower cost product at retail, and they're getting better fuel efficiency than they would with an E85 blend. From the auto perspective, however, you're not getting optimized performance, and that's really why this interest in a high octane fuel spec is gaining so much attention, because in order to really develop an engine that can perform to its optimum level, the engine needs to be calibrated to a predictable fuel blend. And a range of E0 to E85 is not predictable. Now, you have sensors in the system that will calibrate certain components of the flex fuel vehicle, so you are operating at acceptable ranges. But in terms of maximizing the potential and the value of the octane that ethanol is providing, you really do need to figure out a way to optimize that engine so that the consumer is getting the best performance they can imagine from the fuel they're buying. But I think the E20, E30 market is very, very small, and so is the flex fuel vehicle market. So I think any market share potential for the mid-range ethanol and optimized engine, we really need to figure out a way to make it meaningful. In order for retailers to embrace the product, you need to have more than 10% of the vehicles on the road being able to accommodate the product. And so, you're looking at a slow ramp up until you get to that point where market demand and market saturation of the vehicles can justify the introduction of the fuel. At the same time, nobody's going to buy the vehicles if the fuel necessary to drive the vehicles is unavailable. So it's a chicken and egg situation, but I think it's something that needs to be worked on.
Sure. Are we talking one standard high-octane fuel for the future, or a set of octanes? I would suppose like we have now with our regular through premium.
I think what you're looking at is you'd still have regular, you'd still have premium, and then you'd have this higher premium, this higher octane fuel. Some of the people I've spoken with in the auto industry say, look, what we could do is build a high-performance car, say one that usually gets 400 horsepower on a 91 or 93 octane fuel. And then you put an octane sensor in there, and if you're running on 98 octane, you're getting higher performance, maybe you're getting 550 horsepower. But if you don't want to pay the premium, because it's going to be a niche fuel for the beginning, so it's going to be more expensive, most likely, and you want to downgrade and use a 90 and 93, and you're satisfied with 400 brake horsepower, which I think most people would be satisfied with that, then you can buy the regular premium. So there's still going to be that market for it. But I think what you're looking at is a potential market where the vehicle pool starts to shift from predominantly 87 octane regular fuel specification to more and more vehicles being specified for premium or higher. And so the question comes down now, can you produce enough premium fuel to satisfy an increase in demand? And what would the cost associated with that to the consumer ultimately be? And so you're really looking at the balance. But I think we're not going to get to one fuel spec. You're looking at a couple different octanes out there because the consumer wants options, and they want to be able to make a choice based upon their economics at the time and their desired performance.
You know, what's interesting is my last vehicle purchase was a crossover with a four-cylinder turbocharged engine that requires premium, and I think it goes the same way. I mean, I should be able to get much higher, relatively speaking, higher gasoline mileage than I get out of a six-cylinder producing the same horsepower, and certainly notice the performance and all that. But I really haven't done a slide rule examination to figure out, if you add in the cost of premium, whether I'm getting the necessarily saving or not, or if it's a wash. But I think under optimal conditions they can meet the CAFE standards.
I think,
with the top number that they offer there.
I think your example is important because we assume consumers are economically rational when they go to buy a car and buy fuel. We assume that. However, that doesn't necessarily always play out. So a consumer may spend an inordinate amount of time looking at performance specifications, fuel economy, cost of the vehicle. Then they get on the dealer lot, and which one's shiny and blue. And so the emotional element of buying a car, the influence of the dealer and the salesman you're dealing with, the deals available for the certain vehicle, sometimes outweigh the economically rational and expectations that you carry with you. And so I think it is, you might be able to do the calculation on overall fuel economy savings and cost of product, but ultimately it may be what drives better, what do I enjoy driving more, what's giving me the performance I desire.
Right, and one of the commenters added it doesn't require premium, it recommends it, but that's a good point. I mean, it's the explanation is I can run regular fuel in there if I want, but I might encounter a little bit of knock and have generally I'll get a lot, according to the auto manufacturer, I'll get a loss in both the performance off the line as well as my fuel economy by doing so. And I think that ties into some of the thoughts you had discussed earlier, John, with automakers being able to, I think with the right approach, they can tune an engine that'll, as long as you're talking the electronic end of it, that'll be fairly compatible with a range of fuels as long as they know what's going to be out there.
Yeah, and I think the critical issue from a market development strategy is, so you may have vehicles that are premium required, high octane fuel recommended for better performance. That high octane fuel, depending on how it's formulated, may not be approved for all vehicles. And so now you're running into a limited potential market opportunity for the retailers and the fuel providers, so that causes a bigger concern on how you bring it to market. Now, on the octane side, if you have a super high compression ratio engine that's running at pretty high RPMs and you don't put in a high enough octane fuel, not only could you have knock and potential reduced performance, you could cause some engine damage if the compression ratio is high enough. So that is something that needs to be taken into consideration. So these vehicles say premium required. You might be able to run an 87 for a while. I would venture to guess if you did it for a long period of time, it could cause some more significant challenges than you may be anticipating.
Sure, and that also leads into what you just said, another question. So with misfueling, who's liable? Which gets us back to a number of discussions over recent years.
Well, and that's, we have quite a bit of experience with that discussion. So my hope is that if we get into a situation where we're bringing a product that may have some consequences for non-authorized uses, that we have the experience to develop protocols to limit that exposure and make sure that the policies and the market strategies are designed in such a way that we ensure consumer satisfaction at all levels of the supply chain.
I had a quick question, and I think it can be answered fairly. It's a little off track, but it gets back to the hydrogen thing, but I think there's a fairly quick answer to it. Electric is, of course, the issue with electric is people can charge in their garage, but a hydrogen fueling infrastructure. John, what's the ballpark figure for a station today to be able to handle that product?
It really depends on how you're sourcing the hydrogen. So I've always used a number around $2 million per location, but that's anticipating a natural gas supply line to your station with a dryer, a compressor, and a hydrogen reformer on premise. There are models where you are bringing that hydrogen directly off of a pipeline if you're located in a refinery. There's a model where the hydrogen is reformed at a central location and trucked in, and there's some testing being done on central reforming, so you have that type of system. Each one has a different cost structure, and the beauty of the hydrogen development strategy is they're all being tested at the same time to identify what makes the most sense from a logistical perspective, from an operational perspective, and an overall cost. Because ultimately, for the customer to embrace hydrogen, the hydrogen fuel is going to have to be cost efficient, and it can't be at such a high level that people are shocked by the cost and they are going to be turned away from the technology. So finding the best, most efficient, operationally effective means of bringing hydrogen to retail is critical, and I love the fact that the market is testing all of them at the same time to figure out what makes the most sense.
Are there any? I've got a variety of questions, that are kind of highly specific relative to specific octane or RON figures, and what I would suggest to everybody listening to this, and it's something that I'll be taking advantage of at the end of the month. I have known John a long time and trust his expertise, but I think when we start getting into specific fuel chemistry, it might be a bit of a stretch, but
a little bit.
But I mean, that's the whole one of the great advantages to give them a bit of a plug here about the Fuels Institute, because they got folks at the meeting who you could ask virtually any technical question you might have, and they'll give you a very specific answer because they're PhD chemists or they're leading fuel development program at an oil company or just about anything else. And again, I'm looking forward to attending the meeting and being around a variety of perspectives, not just the folks that we usually run into at our industry meetings, but the other folks that are part of our whole industry chain of not only getting fuel to a vehicle, but actually integrating that fuel into the vehicle and having the vehicle run on a roadway. So I think a lot of those, if you're really interested in those, give a good consideration to heading out to the meeting. I think we've started. I think we've kind of hit a bit of a wall here, other than going over some of the more technical things. Here's one. What about high octane meeting RFS dictates? I suppose that's the kind of a real core question, actually. How does this play into the kind of the production, the whole blend wall type of issue, the E85 market? I think we can go out on that. How does it deal with the the production side of the equation?
Well, from an RFS standpoint, if the high octane fuel is being provided by an E25, then you have another source for ethanol going on the market, providing an additional blending opportunities to develop more renewable identification number credits to satisfy the obligation. I think when you look at the RFS numbers, and Fuels Institute's done quite a bit of research on E85 market. We're getting ready to do another updated analysis of the ability to sell E85 into the market with current fuel prices. There are limitations to what E85 can do, and I think we start looking at the numbers, even the RVOs for 2016. I don't think E85 can bridge the gap between what E10s provides and what's necessary. So the ability to bring an E25 to market with substantial market demand and market share could be a benefit to the RFS. Now, you still have the infrastructure limitations, and that is still a challenge. But I think one of the the driving factors and those who are very interested in a high-octane market, there's quite a few who are looking at it from how do we get more ethanol into the market, from a business standpoint for the ethanol producers, from a RFS compliance strategy for those who are trying to figure out a way to satisfy the RFS mandates. So I think that is definitely an element in the consideration for using ethanol as the primary octane source for this new product.
All righty. Well, thank you very much, John, and thanks everybody for attending. Download our presentation and go over to our website if you'd like some registration information, or over to the Fuels Institute website as well to see about that show coming up in Indianapolis, in which I will actually be road testing my high-octane premium turbocharged little crossover and see what I actually get on an extended road trip. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.